In a move aimed at deepening trade ties and positioning Beijing as Africa's key economic partner, China has unveiled plans to offer zero-tariff treatment to 53 African countries with which it maintains diplomatic relations.
Could China's zero-tariff policy push the U.S. out of Africa? While Washington imposes daunting tariffs on African exports, China eliminates them. So is Beijing skillfully seizing an opportunity to supplant the U.S.? And will the new policy really serve to boost African exports and economies?
China's decision to grant zero-tariff access to Ghanaian and African products signals the confidence in our partnership. It opens vast new markets for Ghanaian exporters, agro-processors, and manufacturers. And I'm happy to inform you that we reached agreement in principle.
We have concluded the high-level conversation with China. They have agreed to a reciprocal arrangement between Kenya and China. They have agreed to remove all the tariffs on our tea, on our coffee, on our avocado, and all other agricultural exports.
The announcement did not come with emergency language or dramatic ultimatums. It arrived as a policy alignment, carefully worded and quietly implemented. Zero tariffs between Africa and China. On paper, it looked like a trade facilitation measure. In practice, it signaled a structural shift that challenged assumptions the United States had relied on for decades. For much of the modern trade era, America's influence rested on access. Markets opened or closed based on alignment, compliance, and negotiation. Tariffs were tools. Sanctions were leverage. Supply chains flowed through systems shaped by American standards and institutions. Africa, though growing, remained peripheral to those systems, exporting raw materials and importing finished goods under terms largely set elsewhere. That balance no longer held. Africa's partnership with China on zero tariffs was not an act of defiance, it was an act of optimization. African economies had reached a point where trade friction mattered more than trade symbolism. Tariffs slowed industrialization, raised consumer prices, and discouraged scale. Removing them with a willing partner created immediate advantages. China understood this calculus. Its manufacturers needed markets. Its supply chains needed diversification. Its long-term strategy favored embedded production rather than transactional exchange. Zero tariffs were not generosity. They were alignment. Africa responded pragmatically. Manufactured goods from China entered African markets at lower cost. Machinery, electronics, and industrial inputs became more accessible. Infrastructure projects accelerated. At the same time, African agricultural products, minerals, and processed goods gained preferential access to Chinese markets. Without the burden of entry taxes, trade volumes surged. But the deeper impact lay beneath the numbers. Zero tariffs changed behavior. African firms planned for scale. Chinese firms localized production. Joint ventures expanded. Industrial parks multiplied. Trade ceased to be episodic and became systemic. The United States watched the data with concern. American exporters faced a competitive disadvantage. Tariffs still applied. Regulatory hurdles remained. Shipping costs rose. In markets where price sensitivity was high, American goods lost ground quickly. This was not due to quality or innovation, but to cost structures shaped by policy. America's trade power did not collapse overnight. It eroded incrementally. Each new factory built under zero-tariff assumptions reduced future demand for American imports. Each localized supply chain weakened U.S. leverage. Influence slipped not because it was challenged directly, but because it was no longer necessary. Africa's motivations were clear. For decades, African countries had been told to liberalize markets without reciprocal industrial benefit. Zero tariffs with China offered reciprocity tied to production. Goods flowed, but so did capacity. Skills transferred, technology embedded, employment expanded. This contrasted sharply with America's approach. U.S. trade policy emphasized compliance, standards, and market access, but often decoupled these from industrial development. On the ground, Africa's partnership with China filled that gap. America underestimated the appeal. It assumed concerns about dependency, quality, and sovereignty would slow adoption. Instead, African governments structured agreements to retain control. Tariff removal was paired with local content requirements, joint ownership, and regulatory oversight. The result was not dependency, it was integration. China gained access, Africa gained leverage. The United States lost exclusivity. Trade power, once centralized, began diffusing. African consumers adjusted expectations. Price competition intensified. Local firms scaled faster with cheaper inputs. Export ambitions expanded as access to China's vast market removed barriers long considered insurmountable. The psychological shift was significant. Africa stopped viewing trade as permission granted by distant powers. It became a strategic tool to accelerate development on its own terms. America's response lagged. Internal debates focused on fairness, security, and standards. While valid, these concerns did not address the immediate economic reality African countries faced: growth required speed. Zero tariffs delivered it. As African trade with China deepened, network effects emerged. Logistics corridors optimized for China-Africa trade expanded. Payment systems adapted. Standards aligned. Over time, switching costs increased. Even if American tariffs were reduced later, catching up would prove difficult. This was the collapse Americans did not anticipate. Not a dramatic fall, but a steady loss of relevance. Trade power depends on being central to decisions. As Africa and China made decisions without reference to Washington, America's influence diminished. Africa did not celebrate this shift publicly. There was no rhetoric of rejection. Diplomatic ties with the United States remained intact. Cooperation continued in other domains, but trade priorities were clear. Zero tariffs worked. They delivered tangible benefits quickly. In a development context, results matter more than ideology. China's strategy succeeded because it aligned with Africa's urgency. America's trade power weakened because it relied on assumptions of indispensability. The first phase of this transformation established a new baseline. Africa and China traded freely, industry expanded. America adjusted to a world where its trade terms were no longer default. What followed would determine whether this erosion stabilized or accelerated. But one reality was already set. Trade power, once lost through irrelevance, is far harder to regain than it is to defend. The zero-tariff alignment unfolded quietly, almost invisibly, yet its consequences reached far beyond customs offices and trade statistics. What began as reduced costs at ports evolved into a restructuring of how value was created, retained, and circulated across Africa. The shift no longer revolved around imports alone. It centered on production, control, and long-term positioning in a global economy that was rapidly fragmenting. Factories that once operated below capacity expanded their shifts. Warehouses that had served only as transit points transformed into processing hubs. Across Africa, logistics routes were redesigned not to funnel goods outward in raw form, but to move semi-finished and finished products between regions. The zero-tariff framework with China created certainty, and certainty encouraged investment. China accelerated its localization strategy. Rather than shipping finished goods exclusively from Asia, production was increasingly split. Components were manufactured in China, assembled in Africa, and distributed regionally or exported back to Asia. This arrangement reduced costs, shortened supply chains, and insulated both sides from global trade volatility. For Africa, this mattered profoundly. Industrialization had long stalled at the point where infrastructure ended and financing began. Zero tariffs lowered entry barriers enough to unlock both. Power grids expanded because factories demanded reliability. Transport corridors improved because trade volumes justified investment. Training centers multiplied as demand for skilled labor grew. Employment surged, not only in manufacturing but across supporting sectors. Logistics, maintenance, quality control, packaging, and services expanded in parallel. The benefits spread unevenly, but they spread decisively. The United States watched this transformation with increasing unease. American companies found themselves excluded not by policy bans, but by irrelevance. Their cost structures could not compete with tariff-free alternatives. Their supply chains were longer, their compliance processes slower, their pricing less flexible. Even where American goods were preferred, they were often unaffordable. The erosion of influence became visible in negotiations. African trade officials no longer framed discussions around access to American markets as a central objective. Instead, they sought technology transfer, infrastructure financing, and joint production. When these were not forthcoming, alternatives already existed. This was the strategic loss America had not prepared for. Trade power is not just the ability to sell, it is the ability to shape choices. As African countries gained viable options, American leverage weakened. China did not position itself as a replacement for the United States. It positioned itself as indispensable to Africa's immediate needs. That distinction mattered. Africa did not need alignment, it needed acceleration. Zero tariffs delivered speed. Over time, African economies began coordinating among themselves under this new reality. Regional trade blocs adjusted external tariff schedules to complement the China partnership. Standards harmonized, cross-border supply chains emerged, linking inland producers to coastal export zones. Africa's internal trade grew alongside its external trade. This compounded the impact. Goods produced under zero-tariff assumptions flowed not only to China, but across Africa itself. Markets deepened, demand stabilized, industrial capacity became less vulnerable to external shocks. The United States attempted recalibration. Policy statements emphasized partnership, shared values, and long-term cooperation. Yet these messages struggled to compete with tangible outcomes. Africa had learned a hard lesson over decades. Promises without infrastructure did not create jobs. Zero tariffs were concrete. They reduced costs immediately. They altered balance sheets. They justified risk. American firms, constrained by domestic politics and regulatory frameworks, moved slower. By the time pilot programs emerged, Chinese-African ventures were already scaling. Another shift followed. Financial systems adapted to support the new trade flows. Settlements increasingly bypassed traditional Western intermediaries. Alternative payment mechanisms expanded. This reduced exposure to currency volatility and external financial pressure. For the United States, whose trade power was intertwined with financial dominance, this was a compounding loss. Trade influence weakened. Financial influence followed. Africa did not frame this as de-dollarization or opposition. It framed it as efficiency. Lower transaction costs mattered. Faster settlements mattered. Predictable financing mattered. Once again, practicality outweighed politics. As industrial capacity expanded, Africa's export profile changed. Raw materials still moved, but they were joined by processed foods, manufactured components, textiles, electronics assembly, and machinery parts. China absorbed much of this output, but not all. New markets opened across Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America. Africa was no longer merely a supplier, it was a competitor. This redefined global trade dynamics. American producers faced competition not only from China, but from African firms operating under lower cost structures and preferential access to massive markets. Industries once assumed secure encountered unexpected pressure. The collapse narrative began circulating in American media. It focused on lost markets, declining exports, and strategic surprise. Yet it misunderstood the nature of the shift. This was not a sudden defeat. It was the outcome of years of complacency, revealed by a single decisive move. Zero tariffs exposed the fragility of assumed dominance. Africa's role in this transformation was often mischaracterized. It was not passive. African governments negotiated assertively. They protected strategic sectors. They imposed conditions. They learned quickly from earlier mistakes. The difference this time was leverage. With multiple partners willing to engage on Africa's terms, negotiation dynamics changed. Africa no longer accepted trade deals that extracted value without building capacity. Zero tariffs were conditional, strategic, and revisable. China accepted this because its interests aligned. The United States struggled because its model had not adapted. By the time American policymakers recognized the depth of the shift, the ecosystem had matured. Reversing it would require more than tariff reductions. It would require rebuilding trust, restructuring incentives, and committing to long-term industrial partnerships. These were politically difficult. Africa moved forward regardless. The narrative of America's collapsing trade power gained traction not because America disappeared, but because it stopped being central. In a multipolar trade environment, absence from key growth corridors translated into declining influence. Africa and China had built one of those corridors. It functioned smoothly. It delivered results. It evolved continuously. Trade power is not inherited. It is maintained through relevance. As Africa's economies grew more confident, their strategic horizon expanded. They diversified partnerships further, leveraging the success of the zero-tariff model to negotiate better terms elsewhere. The United States now faced Africa not as a dependent region, but as a negotiating bloc with proven alternatives. Not the collapse of American trade in absolute terms, but the end of its unquestioned primacy. Zero tariffs did not destroy American power. They revealed its limits, and once limits are exposed, the world adjusts. Africa had adjusted first. China had anticipated it. America now confronted a future in which influence had to be earned again, not assumed.